when you do these panels, you're always, trying to get the best board, the panel members, and for boards particularly. So I think I lucked out. So I'm going to do kind of what I promised not to do, which is embarrass you.
I told you not to.
About, who you have in front of you, because you may not have checked out their background. So let me start with Anna. She has more than 20 years experience as an independent board director. She has been recognized by Fortune as one of the most powerful women in international business and ranked among the most influential board directors. But that's just the starters. Your career started when you were a library guard checking backpacks.
Oh my God, you went way back.
Way back. We do our research here at KPMG.
Oh my God. I was a guard at the
You
library.
went from that and ended up leading marketing globally for BP as your first career. And then the board career started with more than 15 companies, including Towers Watson, and you're also on the NACD, the most prominent organization for board directors, which is fantastic. But not only that, you had time to co-found the World Innovation Network, serving on the board of Houston Grand Opera. And you're working with one of the world's leading volunteer organizations to eliminate Alzheimer's disease, which I think is it's a great. I also try to make it personal, so I've dug up some stuff about you guys. In addition to being a frequent speaker on the Finding Fulfillment and Happiness at Home, you have 2 black and silver miniature schnauzers, and you like to get up at 5:30 every day and play Mozart on the piano. So, with that, I'm so glad we could find something useful for you to do to fill all your empty time.
Is that why I hear them tuning the piano around?
Exactly.
Oh my God.
Bring in the grand piano.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And if I were you, Jonathan, of course, that will be a hard act to follow. But I think you can match this. I know Jonathan a little bit longer. You've been ranked the #1 futurist in the world by Forbes magazine, and the world's leading transformation architect by Harvard Business Review. That's amazing. You wrote a couple of books. Rogue Waves, Strategic Luck is the new one. Plug for that. And when I met you, you were the futurist for HP Inc., but you've been the founder of the Center for Radical Change, Singularity University, you're a faculty, and you work with Hollywood on coming up with new worlds for movies like Ready Player One and Blade Runner, which, that hits high in my book. And you're working with the FBI, the War College, and still they let you go to China, where he's actually more known in China than he is over there. So there's something around your powers of persuasion. Privately, I've experienced he's an extreme foodie, almost on the experimental side. And he's organizing serendipity dinners to stimulate creative thinking by combining meals and wine, which I still have to recommend for all of you to try. Now, you might think that this is the techiest, spaciest guy you know until you met his spouse. In his household, he's the down-to-earth guy because she spends her life searching for extraterrestrials at SETI. So, very happy to have you both here, and we're going to get right into the board perspectives. And first of all, how many board members do we have in the audience right now? Hand up. Fantastic. How many want to be in a board in the next 5 years or so? Excellent. So we have a lot of interest in the audience. And we heard earlier before how important the boards are for the AI topic. And I have to say, in my own experience, I've never seen a topic where the boards were so early and so active in both putting on the accelerator and the brakes, often at the same time as it comes to Gen AI. And we heard earlier that you don't move faster than the pace of your middle managers or your change management, but it's very hard for any company to move faster than its board. So I'm going to open up with the first question to you. What has been your experience on how boards have engaged so far with AI, and what have they sort of struggled and succeeded with? Give us a sense of your experience.
Thank you. So I've served on a number of boards across many different industries, and that's why I would preface my remark by saying it varies. There are some companies and some boards that have jumped into the conversation, but I find there are a lot of boards that are still very reluctant, not because they don't believe it's happening, but because they don't understand it. I think we heard Salim's comment this morning about the number of CEOs that say, yeah, I have a to-do list, I need to go back and I need to do something, and then when you follow them, nothing has happened. that's the feeling you get sometimes on some boards as well. And I think the reason is because, so I think I may be the only person in this room that does not have any technology in my background. And you say, well, why is she here? And that's because
I think we just heard why you're here.
No, but I have really made it a concerted effort. I've been very, very deliberate about making sure I stay relevant in the boardroom. My greatest fear is being a board director that is past my due date. I quit my full-time job over 20 years ago, and if I had taken a snapshot of what the executive world looked like then and applied it today, I would be totally irrelevant in the boardroom. So I'm a real believer in board director education. And the thing that frustrates me on some boards where I sit, and I heard someone mention this the other day, this morning, is that we do have some change that needs to happen in boardrooms. The pace of change, I tell people the pace of change will never be as slow as it is today. And if you've got a room of directors that don't want to embrace that, it's a problem. So I think that there are some industries that lend themselves naturally to a conversation around technology because it's about gathering information, it's about finding out consumer behavior, things like that, and people get that. But when you're on a board of a chemical company or on the board of an oil and gas company, oil and gas is a little better, a little closer to the customer. Chemical companies are a little bit farther away from the customer. Getting that conversation going is difficult. I've served on a number of chemical boards over the last 20 years, and it varies by CEO. There are some that say, yeah, we really need to understand this, and others that say, no, it doesn't apply to us. So it really depends on how many voices there are, like mine, in the boardroom that kind of push that conversation.
Agree fully. What about you, Jonathan? You've seen both in the U.S. and you spend a lot of time in China. What are you seeing as happening with the boards on this particular topic if you focus in on Gen AI to start with?
So I see two things. One is they're talking to experts, they're reading the news, they're watching TV, instead of getting on the ground. One of the things we realized at the Center for Radical Change is that you can often see the future if you're where it's happening. I've had the opportunity a couple of times in my career to do that. So what we do with boards is we bring them to change points, inflection points around the world to actually see what's going on, not in the boardroom, not in the board conversations, but on the ground with startups, with regulators, with investors. And I think that's incredibly important because as a board member, your job is to listen to management and approve management, but also to guide management. If you are incentivizing your people, 3 years out, well, a major digital transformation, a major cultural transformation is going to take longer than that. As a board member, that's your responsibility to be thinking 7 to 10 years out. So you've got to be on the ground. You've got to be getting that insight because you are disincentivizing typically your leadership from doing that work. Now, the question I think that we were talking about earlier is how do you do that and keep the nose in and the hands out? Right? What does that relationship look like? And how do we shift as board members at times of change from looking at risk is something that we might or might not have a risk committee, right? And that risk committee is about looking at downside risk and filling out our 10K and approving it, instead of looking at the shift that is happening around us right now, which is we have this argument that you disrupt or be disrupted. But I think that's the wrong argument about innovation. We're moving into a world of deharmonization. And that means that what's more likely is that changes in the world, not changes in your market, will disrupt you. COVID, land wars in Europe, insurance issues, energy shocks. These are things we haven't necessarily dealt with in our lifetimes. There are things that if you have highly operational managers, they're disincentivized to focus on, both in terms of their mindset and their pocketbook. So as board members, we need to get on the ground, we need to get our people on the ground, and we've got to shift this perspective.
So adding to that, I see a couple of my current and former board members in the audience here, and if you think about the speed of development and then the magnitude of change that are hitting board members, right? As you present to them, if you are an executive, be a little bit kind to them, because think about this. Gen AI is the first technology that momentarily affects every part of the company: finance, IT, HR, risk management. Everything is suddenly on the table, and nobody has been trained on that particular technology. And if you go in front of the board, you have to realize that the board is not management. They fulfill a different purpose. They think about the short, mid, long-term, good of the company and the shareholders, and they need to sit in that chair every day and worry: am I doing my job? Am I safeguarding the shareholders, the future, and this company? And what questions should I ask to illuminate, a weakness, or suggest, or probe, etc.? And it's quite stressful. And one thing we did, and I don't see Steve here, but we took 6 hours with our entire board, full day event, to go through every aspect of AI that we could master in that sense. And it was the first time that has ever happened. We have changed our corporate structure. The fact that Steve is here in his new role is because we have, changed the structure to reflect the strategic importance of this. So there's a lot of things happening in the board. But let's not focus on risk at the next step. Let's focus on opportunity. And if you think about your board roles, and what is the hardest thing about making sure that your companies are capturing all the upside that could come? We'll hold the risk for a moment, right? How do you get that courage, and how do you get that sort of stamina in the board to drive management in some areas?
Well, one way to do it actually is to frame it up as risk, and that is there is a risk of not catching the
Right.
upside, right? I mean, I always get upset that risk is always talked about in the negative. You talked about it earlier, negative risk.
Yeah, risk is beta.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Two sides.
But there's a huge part of missing what's happening that's considered a risk. I think, one of the real issues that work against a legacy company when it comes to figuring out how to innovate is this legacy of, especially if it's a public company, of incrementally every quarter a little bit better. We struggle with what's the guidance? How are we going to change the guidance this quarter? And there's an expectation in the investor world that we understand the business model, and you need to do it faster, you need to do it cheaper, you need to do it better. And so there's this paradigm that we look for incremental improvement.
Right.
I think that works against us as much as the internal antibodies that Salim talked about today. And that is, you have been paid to make sure you incrementally improve on the existing capital structure, on the existing sunk capital that's in the ground, if you have that. I mean, every quarter the CFO has to get up in front of investors and talk about that. And that goes against a lot of innovation, because you end up spending a lot of time talking to people in the same orbit that are trying to figure out the same thing. You're talking to the KPMGs, you're talking to your auditors, you're talking to your compensation consultants. Are we paying people based on the right behaviors? And it all goes to incrementalizing a little bit better. And that's why disruption rarely happens from legacy companies, and it always happens to them rather than by them. And so I think that's one real issue that if you're a technology person presenting to a board, one of the things you've got to figure out how you impress upon people is, do you see what's happening out in the world? Do you see what is out there that can actually change the entire business model of what we're doing? And I think the example of photography, someone talked about photography today, I think it was Salim. Absolutely. Would it have made sense to be in the Kodak boardroom talking about why are we still doing these boxes of orange film when there's technology that's out there that can make it obsolete?
Well, technology that was in many ways invented by Kodak.
Yes.
This is an interesting question. Does the board allow management to invest? Does the board disincentivize failing to invest in the future? We talked about this last year, but I'm going to bring it up again. When I was at HP in 2019, Carl Icahn had optimized the heck out of Xerox with his Scion, and he was trying to drive a lockup between HP and Xerox to take those efficiencies into a larger organization. That seemed like a really good idea to investors. I thought it was going to work. And then 2020 hit, and COVID hit, and the world shifted. Xerox's earnings per share dropped 96% and stayed there. HP saw all-time highs in terms of unit sales, revenue, and margin because of small decisions we made over time that investors didn't like because they didn't look efficient in the quarter. But two companies, closest US peer competitors, printing companies, had radically different outcomes from the same event. As a board member, I think the key question you need to be asking is not just, are we creating disruptive innovation, but are we innovating for disruption?
And are you bringing your investors along on the journey?
Right.
And I think that this is where leadership comes into play. And that is, I mean, I've seen CEOs do a masterful job of taking over companies that are struggling and investors kind of chomping at the bit saying, what the heck is wrong with you? And I've seen phenomenal CEOs say, okay, here's what we're looking to do. Here's why I need time. You need to give us time. And when you take investors along with you to say, here's what's happening in the market, here's what we think is happening to our business model, we actually need to innovate around this, you need to give us time. If you've got the track record of delivering in the past, if you've got a CEO that's got a reputation of delivering, they're gonna give you time. If you don't bring your investors along, and a board needs to make sure the narrative is good.
Yeah.
If you don't bring your investors along, they're not gonna trust you.
Right.
And that's what happens when you have a difference between a Xerox and an HP, in my belief.
I think that is very much true. One of the challenges with HP, and I think it's a microcosm of a lot of board discussion around investors, is it was a spin out. It was supposed to be supposed to be the cow that was milked.
Right.
And so they were supposed to disincentivize R&D, so on and so forth, all the things investors say when you're in that cycle. What became clear, what I believe was a moment, was to shift the investor mix. How do you, as a manager or as a board member, drive that conversation? Because that is a scary conversation, which is necessary for what you're talking
You absolutely have to. And we in board meetings, spend a lot of time looking at our investor base and saying, do we have the right kinds of investors? And I think your investors will self-select based on not only performance, but the story you're telling. And they're gonna say, is this a company that our company would invest in, or is this one that we want to sell and go somewhere else? I think it has to do with how well you communicate with investors, and you need to be communicating on a regular basis, not just once a year or once a quarter. As long as they understand what the story is, they will decide on if this is the kind of company they want to invest in. And if you tell a story and an investor who isn't with you yet says, aha, that's the kind of company I want to invest in, you'll bring it in. But if you're not out there telling the story and you don't have a believable narrative about how you're innovating, how you're dealing with change, I think you're going to end up with the wrong kinds of investors bailing on you at the wrong time.
Interesting question for you, Jonathan, on that. When you talk to Hollywood and movie studios and you're painting the story about that Ready Player 2, you got to sell it to the audience as much as the investor. Any reflections on what Anna just said around how do you paint that scenario in a way that sells?
So two things, right? There's all kinds of regulation, and my goodness, there's probably auditors in the room and controllers.
KPMG.
So I'm going to say some things that are scary. The first is I was working on this thing called frustrated total internal reflection, which is this really boring technology. And I was looking for machine vision for pose estimation for about 10 years. Totally boring things until you saw Minority Report. And all of a sudden, Tom Cruise is doing ballet and computer, nothing besides requests for the ability to type while doing ballet for the next 5 years. Like, I built a business around doing R&D on this. It's completely insane. That's a terrible idea. But Hollywood made the story real. Right? And then we saw this thing and Steve Jobs do this with a smartphone, and all of a sudden we were off to the races, right? There's a lot of value in tying film narrative to your technology narrative. I've never not seen a shift like AI happen or touch screens happen without that happening too. Right? It happens there first, and that's where we find our metaphor for what happens next.
So let's move to the topic of risk. And I'm going to go to you, Jonathan. You wrote a book, or several, but Rogue Waves was all about not preventing, but managing different types of risk, COVID, et cetera, before it happened. Apply that now to Gen AI and the boards that are going to have to think differently about risks in the short, mid, and long term. What are some things you're seeing that they're doing right and wrong?
That's a small question. So what I'm seeing at a faster rate than I've ever seen before is we've gone from this thing that came out of the market in 2022 based on a paper that was written in 2017. And we're now in 2024, and we're saying, where's the business model? Maybe this is bogus. I don't know. Like in 1971, the first email was written by Ray Tomlinson. If 3 years later, people were like, what's the business model for AI? How do I do that? Which they were. Looking back, we'd say that's insane. Right now, what we need to be doing is thinking about three things. One, how we're going to be transforming the architecture of our firms based on this new technology. That's 2-3 year cycle. If you do an M&A, get it kind of working. If you want to change a process, bring in SAP, Oracle, whatever, it's a 3 year cycle, right? There's a year of politics and planning, a year of doing it, a year of fixing everything you just broke. But if you want to change a culture, like Satya Nadella did at Microsoft, that's a 5 to 7 year process to make your company at least as AI ready as Microsoft is today. So we can choose the year that you want, but I think the real breakthroughs happen 2030, 2032, maybe 2035. I think it's an infrastructure play more than a software technology play that's going to limit things. That means that today or next year or the year after, you've got to be making some serious cultural changes in your organization before the technology changes are available.
And I'm going to pick on Anna, you talked about that also. What pressures did that put on the structure of the board, the role of, do you need an AI specialist on the board? Does everyone need to be an AI specialist? How should the governance question change in light of what Jonathan did?
Well, I think governance overall needs to change because we're still using the model that we used 30 years ago today. It used to be, I started doing board work 20 years ago, and I've seen so much change. But 20 years ago, most people who joined boards finished a 25 to 30 year career in a corporation. They joined when they were 60 years old, and therefore they were good for 10 years. You had automatic, roll off at 70 or 72. That absolutely makes no sense today because we're bringing people on to boards in their 40s. I started when I was 43, so it would be ridiculous for me to think I could stay on a board for 30 years and add value. So I think the structure needs to change. I also think the voices around the room need to change. It used to be, as long as you were a sitting former CEO, former CFO, you could assume you were going to get on a board. That's changed a lot because we actually need people who know more and know deeper topics than just general management. I think general management's important, but Sarbanes-Oxley necessitated financial expertise, and I think that was a brilliant thing to do. Now, did that excuse the rest of us from being able to read a P&L? No. I'm not a financial expert, but I can read a P&L, and I know how to help with financial decisions. I think when it comes to technology, very similar. I think it would be great to have someone with deep technology functional expertise in the boardroom, but two things are important. One, that does not excuse every other board director from being technologically literate. You cannot default to one person whenever there's a conversation about AI. That's not how it's going to work. And secondly, that individual also needs to know how to be a fully fledged board director. If the first day of your meeting, the AI is not the big subject, but it's activist in the boardroom, you need to be able to contribute. So if you're a technical person that has aspirations to join a board, what you need to do is shore up your understanding of what board directors do in general.
Will it be, talk about the software and the character of board members. Do you think it'll be more important or less important to be that activist on the board and create a little bit of discomfort?
So I'm a real believer in collegial boards. I am not a believer in comfortable boards. I think discomfort creates progress and learning, and it forces people to understand what they don't know. I really believe in people being respectful, though, and being collegial. So those are the best boards I've been on, are the ones that are collegial but not uncomfortable with being uncomfortable.
Before we open up for questions, I'm going to do a quick lightning round here, and it's all about, imagine that we're on this stage with, 100, 200, 300 people 36 months from now, and we think back to what we talked about today. What would we kick ourselves on? We should have spent more time on that, and we saw it coming, and we talked about that instead. What would be your quick one thing?
I would say, how did so many companies miss the change that happened quicker than they thought it would happen? I do believe that the rate of change is going to be astronomical in the next 3 years. And decisions that we make in the next year or two are going to be very important.
John?
I'd say spending time understanding the historical risks and disruptions and how they've played out that haven't happened in our lifetime. Think about COVID. This had happened before. We had some idea what would happen next, and yet boards around the country, around the world were in denial about the natural path of progression of this thing. They weren't prepared, and then they were responsive throughout. And what I've seen in a lot of the reporting is they thought they did a good job. In a world of more disruption, that's not possible.
And we also allowed politics to get involved with the best decision. And I think that's a real danger that we will continue to have in the next 3 years.
And I commit to you, next time we're here, if it's that seat will not be empty. It will be filled with GPT-5 or 6, and we'll have, that to encourage as well. So I know we have 2 minutes left. I actually don't see the app. If there's any questions that are coming from the audience, either just raise your hand, or maybe somebody can help me putting it up on stage, on the screen. Questions from the audience?
There's one right there.
Board members? Yeah.
I'll throw one in. Regarding public companies, your thoughts on regulation regarding selection of board members or qualifications of board members?
I think it will be a sad day if we have to be regulated by the government in terms of what voices should be around the table. I think that nom and gov committees need to step up and really talk about what are the skills we need around to help this company through its current chapter, and how do we onboard and offboard directors. I think that it's a shame when you wait so long to do the right thing that you end up having a group of people that don't understand your business telling you what you need to do. That's my oil and gas background seeping in there. It is.
One more question. Oh, there we go.
Yay, we have questions. Oh,
Let's see that pop up.
disappeared.
Anyone else want to shout out a question?
There's someone hiding over there.
Go for it. You.
For John. John, I think to oversimplify your lesson to the team was to not ignore history and to study the patterns of the past to understand how current events play out using previous pandemics and the current pandemic to illustrate, reality to it.
I think that we don't understand the scale of change that's possible. Most of my career, we've been living in a world of greater harmonization. We're going clearly to a different cycle that's going to be less harmonized. We do not have the human experience in our executive teams to understand what that is without looking at history. I'm not saying that history repeats itself. I'm saying that it's a lesson about what's possible in terms of scale of change.
Thank you so much, and a big applause to my fantastic panel members.